How many languages do you speak?
Well, I speak all languages. I also see a lot of people using vocabulary from English to throw into their language. It's ridiculous. If you're trying to learn that language, then you should block out everything else, including your English and whatever else, and just use that language. Turns out he's a professor of the Chinese language, but he couldn't order his coffee in Chinese.
Okay, so I think it's important for people to know the mission behind Glossica. Can you share what's the overall goal and the mission and the problem you're trying to solve in a bigger sense?
Yeah, I mean, we're currently building the Glossica Viva platform so that we can support the 7,000 languages out there in the world. I mean, there's a lot of languages out there that have no representation outside of their own local community. And these could be even large languages with millions of speakers. Like you may find languages in India and Africa and various parts of the world that have millions of speakers. They could be underrepresented languages even in the United States, such as Navajo or Cree in Canada, that have a number of speakers. They're in fear of losing their language. They are also looking for ways that their languages can live online and have access to, input methods and typing and all these other ways of communication. But not only that, but being able to just use the language. And the reason why it's important for these languages to be represented in the modern age of technology is primarily because as mass communication and media keeps growing throughout the world, you get these larger languages that start kind of just stepping on the foot of everybody else. And so when all of your media starts getting passed around in just English or other world, major languages like Spanish and Chinese and Russian, then what you get is less and less media in these other smaller underrepresented languages. And so as that continues on a trend, what you'll find is that a lot of people, they don't want to use their languages anymore in favor of the majority language, mainly because they want to reach a larger audience. But I think it's better to live in a world, in a a world full of different languages, because languages are unique voices, and we like having unique voices in the world. And not only that, if you think about communities like the Navajo, a lot of these indigenous cultures, and we have indigenous cultures right here in our neighborhood in Formosa, the Formosan languages, but it's kind of the same thing, where if you delete the language from these communities, then everything that's tied into their history, their culture, who they are and what they represent, and their own identity, their language, their dance, their song, and all of their traditions, for example, in all of their customs, language plays a central role in all of that. And not only that, but there's a lot of information locked up in these languages regarding the natural world. For example, a lot of the great medicines that have been developed throughout history have come from the knowledge of indigenous languages. And so when that information gets shared with the rest of the world, we can now create medicines that help people in larger populations around the world. That's just one example of how indigenous languages can help the world at large. So there's actually not just the issue with the information that's available in these languages and part of our fully known human knowledge. We want the knowledge to be added to our whole knowledge of what we know in this world. But those languages also represent a very central part to their culture and their customs. So our role at Glossica is to be able to give them that platform that exists. Now, there's a lot of young people in these communities who don't speak these languages fluently. And so what we want is to be able to provide those languages to these people that connect with those cultures, and to be able to have the ability to recover and revitalize and relearn these languages and get to be part of that community again. There may be some outsiders that also want to learn these languages and learn about the culture and be part of that community. And there are doctors who serve these communities who need to learn these languages as well and be able to communicate with these communities. So it's important that that languages are alive and well, and that they are able to be learned by people who interact with these communities. And a lot of times, governments also want to have the ability to communicate with the communities in their country, even though they're not imposing the national language on these communities and enforcing them to speak the national language. So it's important that they also have the ability to communicate with these communities. Mm-hmm. And so Glossika is playing that role of giving them that place online to not only have their language represented there, but also allow the world to have a way to communicate with them, and also empower them to be able to communicate and send out media at the same time with all of the major languages in their own language and voice.
Yeah, so can you share some of the languages on Glossika that are almost like dying or threatened to be extinct that you're trying to preserve?
Right now, we don't have a large selection of languages that are close to extinction. We do have Manx, which is the island, the language of the island of Man, spoken between England and Ireland.
Wow.
But the Manx language is closely related to Scottish Gaelic and Irish. Mm-hmm. So anybody who knows one of these two languages could easily learn Manx, because it's kind of like a variation of the two. But there are some other languages out there in the world. For example, we have here in Taiwan on Formosa, a lot of the indigenous languages are very close to extinction.
Right.
Like Tla'alua, Kanakanafu, Thao. Thao is a language that I've learned myself. Zhou is spoken by a strong, it's a vitality, it has a strong vitality, and Bunun as well. These are, and Amis, these are some of the more well represented, but their numbers are still very small. So throughout history, we've had communities on Earth of less than 10,000 people who speak languages that now have become billion people languages. Mm-hmm. Like Chinese way back in the day may have only had 10,000 speakers at one point, right. And it's grown to what it is today. So not every small language community, just because it has less than 10,000 speakers, means that it's a language that is endangered. It just means that it's just a small community.
Right.
But those small communities are threatened by mass media and communication surrounding them, or by their national languages that may kind of like trample on them and eventually end up making them disappear over time. And we've seen that in countries like in Italy, where you get the standard Italian language, which has now been in existence for 150 years. But now you get these regional languages are starting to disappear in favor of that national language.
Right.
So this has happened in many countries. Germany is one, France is one, Spain is one. These are all national languages that are basically invented. You were just asking me about Indonesian
right.
a few minutes ago, and Indonesian hasn't been around for a long time, but it's a Malay dialect that based on the Malay standard, but it's sort of kind of a bridge to help people speak with each other. Because if you have a Sundanese speaker talking to a Balinese speaker talking to a Javanese speaker, well, it's better they just all speak Indonesian so they can communicate with each other and understand what the government has to say as well.
Yeah. Okay, so then here's something that we all been wondering about you. How many languages do you speak?
Well, I speak all languages. I mean, if I learn how to count to 10.
Okay, dad joke here.
Yeah, so if I learn how to say hello, thank you, goodbye, and you're welcome, then yeah, I suppose I could speak all languages. So a better question to ask is, how many languages could I hold a conversation in?
Yeah.
Like, could I order a drink or order a ticket, or, that's going to be a lot of languages, maybe 100. But could I actually talk about philosophy and psychology in those languages? Well, I don't know very much about those things even in English. So I would say that I probably couldn't talk a whole bunch in English about those.
Right.
So does it mean that I can't speak English? So it really depends on what kind of topic you want to talk about.
Yeah.
So if I'm talking about language in particular, I could probably have that conversation in a dozen languages.
Okay.
The things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
If I was just going to order a coffee and drinks, I could probably do that in 50 to 100 languages. I don't know the exact number. But my goal over time is kind of, how many languages could I actually end up understanding in a lifetime? It could be several hundred languages, simply because I can use one as a stepping stone to understand the next one, as they're just variations on, they're dialects of each other. So I can understand a lot of Chinese dialects because I've spent a lot of time researching them, even though I don't speak them actively. So I can understand quite a lot of them.
So it sounds like you're almost getting a kind of compound interest on what you've already invested in learning some basic languages. Now that it's accelerating whatever new languages you're learning. Would you say that language learning can achieve this kind of compound interest?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like compound interest. That's an interesting way to put it. So languages, they developed over time. They split off from each other in the world. And so they developed over a period of 5,000 to 10,000 years to the point today where they look nothing like their neighbors. And so during that 5,000 to 10,000 year period, each of those individual branches have now turned into families of languages. And these families of languages now resemble nothing like the next neighboring family. So within each of these families of languages, you could think of a whole family of languages being like dialects of each other. They all have small variations of each other. So if you ever compare like Italian and Spanish, you'll notice there's a lot of things really similar about these two languages. In fact, let's go to a further example. I'm sure that most people have heard Russian. They may not have heard Ukrainian. But if I were to ask an individual person, like just any average person off the street, oh, here's somebody speaking Russian or Ukrainian, which one is which? Nobody can actually tell you the difference, right? Unless they've actually studied the language. So that's the thing, is that a lot of these are just variations on a theme. So Slavic has its own theme, and Polish and Czech and Russian and Ukrainian, they all have a variation on that theme. And so for somebody to learn one of their neighboring languages is super easy. They don't really need to study the grammar at all. I mean, they might learn the word, for example, they might learn the word for hour, and they might learn the word for time. And in one language, it's this one word, and in the other language, it's the same word, or maybe it's a different word. And they just need to learn that, oh, the word chas doesn't mean this exact same thing in the other language. It means this other meaning. So sometimes they use the same vocabulary, but it has a slightly different meaning.
Right.
So for them to actually acquire another language, they don't really have to go to school. They don't really need textbooks. They don't even really need dictionaries. They just need exposure and to say the sentences and practice those sentences. Once a Slovak person listens to a Polish sentence and understands that sentence and repeats it out of their own mouth, they're actually learning to get fluent almost immediately. So that's what Glossika really solves. So within a language family, it's actually really easy and very quick to learn neighboring languages using the Glossika method. Now, what I've done in my own lifetime is I've tried to find representative languages in various language families as a starting point to learn many of the languages within that family. So in southern India, there's a language family called Dravidian, a very ancient old language family. They've got very large languages spoken by many people, like Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam. And so some of these other languages people have probably never heard of, especially like Canada. It sounds like a country name, but it's actually the name of a language. And so I've spent some time learning this language, Kannada. But since I have more, like I can watch movies in Kannada, I can also watch movies in Tamil. And the more exposure that I get to like Tamil media means that I can actually acquire two languages at the same time. Like I'll understand more and more Tamil at the same time while I'm learning to speak Kannada. Even though they're different, distinct languages and they have different vocabulary, it's almost like I can acquire both because they have very similar patterns.
Yeah.
And not only that, I can watch a movie in Malayalam and then suddenly I'm like, whoa, that's like a different accent of Tamil, but almost kind of the same. And it's like almost I can pick up three languages with just focused study of one. Right. So I kind of use these hacks to like try to pick up a smaller language within a larger media influence, and then see if I can pick up one or two or three languages within that media influence. And at some point I can boost my understanding of the language. I may not be able to speak them, but I think it's just kind of a fun experiment. So, you know, whether I speak 10 languages or 20 languages or 30, I don't think it's really that important what the number is, but I think it's fun to explore the world and learn new things and be able to understand more and more people, and being able to get on the ground and and order things in Greek and go to Italy and then go to Dubai and go to India and, getting more and more conversational in Thai and Vietnamese, Tagalog, Indonesian. It's fun. It's just fun to go and experiment and experience all of these different languages and cultures. And every country I go to, I try to learn how to do the basic stuff
right.
in their local language. And it just makes the experience so much more fun.
Yeah, and you can just see people getting delighted, right? To see
Yeah.
this foreigner speaking Tamil or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it opens a lot of doors, especially the deeper you go into a language, the more doors open when
Yeah.
you travel.
And if you really learn like positions in your mouth, where to pronounce everything, you can mimic people exactly. It really astonishes them. They're like, whoa, how did you do that? There's like no accent. But it might have been the first word I've ever said in their language.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get to that point where you can mimic that pronunciation, that's really a cool place to be.
So why do you think language learning is such a pain for most people? Is it that they just don't have the exposure?
Well, they just make it so much of an academic pursuit.
So you think
They think it's a lot of memorization, and I just think language learning is just a lot of experience. Mm-hmm. It's just like living life.
So let's say somebody really wants to learn a language. Let's say you live in Kansas and you want to learn Japanese. How do you get the exposure?
Well, just going off of what I said with language being experienced, it's like there was a linguistic study done a number of years ago where they would test the person's amygdala response in the brain if they heard the word knife shouted. Mm-hmm. So because of your experience growing up with the English language, or with our listeners growing up with the English language, if somebody says knife or if somebody says gun, your internal response is going to react to that sound, to that word. Whereas if I yell it out in a different language, even if you've learned that language, there just isn't the same amount of amygdala response, or the fear factor of response in the brain. And so what they were measuring was how much do bilingual speakers have a preference for one or the other, fully bilingual from birth. And so what's interesting about that is that if the more exposure you get to the language, for example, if you have that environment and you have experiences from your childhood or earlier in life, it might have just been 1 or 2 years ago, if you have those experiences where the sounds resonate in your brain. For example, I can think back of experiences I've had in Greece or in Italy and recall the sounds that were said at that time, recall the smells. Maybe there was a food or a dinner at the time, or things that happened, and those sounds resonate in my brain. I can now recall them. I didn't memorize anything. All I did was experience, right? And so those experiences are so valuable. They carry with us throughout our life. And so when you have those experiences, that's kind of what we call immersion, right? Those carry on with us for a long time. So I think that having the sound of the language and you don't necessarily need an amygdala response or a fear response in the brain, but if you have an emotional response, or you tie it in with so if I'm learning a new language and I'm just using my cell phone, the best way to do it is to go to a new place in the world where I'm having a new experience for that day, sitting in a coffee shop or a restaurant where we're getting aromas and smells. And I'm experiencing it in a new location with new sounds, and that's going to create a long-term memory that I didn't even have to try hard to memorize.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So if somebody's in Kansas and they want to learn Japanese, I would say the same thing. It's like, what stops you from, traveling to the next town? What stops you from going to Omaha or Wichita or Dallas or Chicago? And going and putting yourself in a new environment, going into a new restaurant, or just walking in the park or along the lake, listening to your app and repeating the sentences, imagining a view of Japan, or even finding, if you've done your practice online on your own time and now you're ready to face the people, and going to a Japanese restaurant and say, hey, can I order in Japanese with you? Would you be willing to do that with me? And then they said, yeah, of course, I'm Japanese. もちろん. And then, okay, so let's do it. And then, just preparing other people to say, I want to do this in your language. I think they would be very happy to assist.
I think the opportunities for immersion and language experiences are everywhere because people travel all over the world, and there's everybody from everywhere in every country. So then that begs the question, what are the mental blocks that people put on themselves where they say, for example, oh, my Japanese pronunciation is so bad, so I don't want to use it, I don't want to speak. Because as you must know, that's a big problem, right? People's own limiting beliefs.
Yeah.
How do you think, why do you think we have those, and how do you think we can overcome that?
One of the problems with creating immersion environments is that if the two individuals in that, or more individuals in that environment, share a language that they're fluent in, let's say it's English, then at some point the immersion will fail. And they will switch to English to express their basic needs and priorities, wants or desires. Okay, so the best immersion environment is where you get two or more individuals together. They do not have a shared language, but they're all trying to learn the same language. So you have at least one native speaker or more in that environment. Let's say it's the shop owner or restaurant owner. But the shop owner doesn't speak the language of the two guests. And the two guests, let's say one person comes from China, the other one comes from Spain, and the restaurant owner is Japanese. The Japanese person doesn't know English very well. Maybe these two know English, but it's not good enough to speak to each other in English. They only have one choice. Their goal is to learn Japanese, and so they all three use Japanese with each other. They're forced into that situation. Now, the reason why everybody says children learn languages faster is because the only environment that children are in a social environment, is usually the classroom. And the only language that exists in a classroom, common among all students, is usually the language of the school, of the teacher, and of the classroom. And so if anybody joins this classroom, they're forced into the immersion environment to use the language of that classroom.
Yeah.
So they learn faster, but they don't learn any faster than adults in the exact same situation. Because your desire to be able to communicate trumps everything else that you're trying to do.
So would you say that you can learn a language equally fast at any age as long as the immersion environment is there?
Yeah, but they can't have a language in common with you.
Right.
Because then your urge to kind of fall back on plan B, English or whatever it is going to be so great.
Yeah.
Like even your urge to ask for where the bathroom is, you must, where's the bathroom? But if you had to pause and think about like how to say that, Hongnam Tina, like you had to figure out how to say that in the language, then you would be forced to use that language to communicate your need.
Okay, so that's actually the secret, and it sounds like everyone really misunderstands the fundamentals of immersion in language learning.
I also see a lot of people using like vocabulary from English to throw into their language, or maybe from neighboring, like people are always trying to mix things up.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous because I mean, if you're trying to learn that language, then you should block out everything else, including your English and whatever else, and just use that language. And you will find a lot of success. And no matter how hard it is to express, because everything that I'm expressing right now, even in this conversation, can be broken down into many easier sentences and like simple English version of what I'm saying. And so if you learn how to translate everything that you want to say into a simplified version using the words that you know in that language, then you will use that language more successfully. The other person will use some vocabulary you may not be familiar with, but hopefully 80% of the vocabulary you will understand. It's what we call N plus 1. You understand N, they provide plus 1 input, and you learn it from the context. You're like, oh, I bet that word he just said, even though I don't understand, probably means this. And then if you experiment and you use that word back with him, and he's like, yeah, he understands, you've now mastered a new word. So the N plus 1 environment means that you understand a majority of what's being said, you pick up the rest from context, and then you regurgitate it in your own communication.
Yeah, well, that takes off a lot of the pressure of learning a language to know that you only really need 80%, and 20% you'll pick it up from
Well, I mean,
context.
that's how we built our technology in the app as well.
Right.
Is to do it's basically all just N plus 1. So if you start from the beginning and you go through it all, it's all N plus 1 all the way up until you're like an advanced speaker. So
You mean the app includes the N and the plus 1?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we don't give you like the training wheels, like basics of every language, but if you have like the basic 50, I mean, you could actually start with 20 words. Like the word can, I, you, go, have, not have, one negative word. I mean, you could start with a handful of words, like 10 words, 20 words, and you could take Glossica all the way to advanced level.
Okay.
I mean, just using Glossica. I'm not saying Glossica is the one and only solution, but it's you can do a lot with the tools available. Yeah. All right, so Michael is going to choose. I created this massive poster of 7,000 languages. There's probably 8,000 languages on there because it includes all the dead languages too.
How long did it take for you to make this?
I used computer programs to output it, so it's
Wow.
not as time consuming as you think.
Every language ever.
It took a little bit of time, but not
Yeah.
too bad.
Okay, so where is West Central Oromo from?
West Central Oromo, it's in Ethiopia. It's probably it's under the Afro-Asiatic language family, Cushitic.
Yeah, correct. Yawarargar.
That sounds Australian. Is it red?
Yeah.
It's very... Oh, it probably went extinct already.
Okay, here's one you don't know. You won't know. Potangi. Potangi Olar Gadaba.
Wait, how do you spell it?
Pottangi. Potangi.
Potton?
I just lost it. There's so many words.
Okay.
I lost it. Potangi.
Every word is written in a foreign language. Isn't that crazy? It's like every name.
I don't want to destroy this by manhandling it, but
Yeah.
it's a beautiful
I
piece
created
of
this in 2009 for the Polyglot conference. But
Wow.
that the thing about all these languages in the world is that the number of languages now, 4 years later, is more than the languages in 2019. Because we've discovered dozens of more languages.
Right.
And some of these languages at the time have been found to be same, so they've been merged, and some of them have been found to be different, so they've been divided into two different languages. So every year there's an update to all of these languages, and each of these languages have a 3-letter ISO code, and ISO means International Standard Organization. So every language in the world has an international standard code. And if they find that one language should be split into two, they'll give both of them a code.
Okay.
And if they're combined, so on and so forth. So most of the time they discover new sign languages every year. But in addition to new sign languages, I think the large countries like India and China, they get 5 or 6 new languages every year. So even though languages die, the actual total number of languages on Earth known to us actually increases every year.
Crazy.
Fascinating fact. And actually, the languages aren't dying at that fast of a rate. Back in the 90s, somebody said that languages are dying every 2 weeks. But in the first 2 decades of this century, that figure has not held up. I mean, we've only lost a handful of languages. I think between 2011 and 2020, there were or 2019 when I made this, there was 11 languages that went extinct.
Right.
So there's always at the top of this poster, I say that there are Just to give you guys the facts, there are 4,670 healthy languages in the world. 1,074 are threatened, so a smaller number. And then moribund are the languages on their deathbed, 278. Or in other words, they have about 25 years left, or one generation. And nearly extinct, we have 410 languages. So nearly extinct within the next 10 years, they're all elders, probably going to die. 400 languages out of 7,000 on Earth. So kind of put that into perspective. We may not be able to save all those languages, but at least all of those healthy languages, of which there are 4,670, they may not even have writing systems. Like Taiwanese Hokkien, spoken here in Taiwan, is a very large language. It's not, I mean, it's got tens of millions of speakers worldwide, but it doesn't have like a standard writing system.
Right.
So not all languages have a writing system. And we hope that we are able to build a technology that doesn't require them to have writing systems, but we can actually still teach the language. Can we teach a language without using a writing system? Now, if you're going to use a lot of the popular apps out there in the world, it's almost like you need a writing system and visual aid to learn this language. But I'm trying to create the technology so that we can teach you a language without ever having to see the writing system. Just like a child would learn it in the classroom.
Right. All through listening.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now that's a challenge worth fighting for.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get back into your story. When did you realize that you had this passion for learning languages? At what age, and what was the situation?
Well, I grew up in many different countries, so I was always surrounded by languages, was fascinated by why people speak differently and why is it so hard to like understand these other languages. As time went on, with more exposure and experience to word roots and word families and language families and how they change over time, I realized, well, there isn't that much difference between, like, for example, the languages of Europe. And then when you jump into other families, it's the same thing. And in fact, the funny thing about it is that the languages in China, like, did you know that the word for Beijing is spelled on old maps as baking?
Right, with a P.
Spelled with a P and a K.
And a K, yeah.
Right? So why did it change to B and a J? And it's now pronounced Beijing? Well, I guess people in international news organizations, they say Beijing. It's kind of weird, but it's actually Beijing, right? But why the change from Peking to Beijing?
I think they're just trying to sound more like the real Mandarin, whereas before it was just a anglicization of it. Is that a word?
Yeah. But why do we say the word spaghetti with a G and not with a J?
Oh, no.
Well, the Italians add an H to make that G sound.
Oh.
But without the H, it would be J. Just like you have in the word gesticulare, to gesture. J. The same thing that happens in Chinese languages, in all languages in Chinese, or in other language families, happens the same thing in European languages, meaning K becomes J over time. So what we know about languages is that they change in predictable ways. So that G is going to become a J, and the C is going to become an S, or like a Ch, as it is in Italian. Like, they don't say cello, they say cello. They add an H, like an orchestra. So it actually explains a lot of the spellings we have in English. That may go back to other languages and language families languages in Europe. But those actual sound changes, exact same things happen in the Chinese languages as well. In all language families. So these things are predictable. And it actually helps us be able to acquire other languages, because other languages are actually just like our own languages. Yeah. I mean, if you don't know Chinese and I say, this guy is called Baba, you could probably understand that's the word for father.
Right.
And this other person over here is Mama. You'd probably understand that that's the word for mother. So in Georgian, a language of the Caucasus, Mama is the father. So sometimes it's not always exact the same, but you'll get the same sounds across the world's languages. And so people communicate in very similar ways. Big, round, bubbly things, we call it bubble in English, and they call it pa-pa in Chinese, but they both have an explosive sound on the lip. Ba-ba-pa-pa.
Right, like a bubble exploding.
Yeah. So there's a lot of these things that are just just common to all humans around the world. And so we think in very similar ways. We use sounds in very similar ways, but they slowly change over time into different variations. And so Chinese languages are not all that different than European languages in that sense, in the phonological sense.
Yeah, I remember the first time I had a conversation in Chinese was total accident. Somebody asked me a question. I thought I didn't know the answer, but I just suddenly replied it, and then there was another question, and I replied that one. And then I had this realization. That was my first conversation in Chinese, but I didn't even...
You remember your first conversation? I don't remember mine, but...
I remember it, and I remember thinking that I didn't know I could have a conversation in Chinese, but I just kept hearing stuff, and my brain
responded.
Yeah, recording what I was hearing, and then I just automatically responded. But for everyone, language, not for everyone, but for most people, language learning is such a headache, and you said it's because it becomes an academic pursuit.
Yeah.
Do you feel like we just have the whole concept of language learning wrong, and we need to just make it more, like you said, an experience?
Well, let me share another anecdote here, because I was standing in line at a coffee shop. This is almost 20 years ago. And I was already a proficient speaker of Chinese. And the guy in front of me, I was in Taiwan at the time. So the guy in front of me was a foreigner, or a Caucasian, a white man. And we got to talking. Turns out he's a professor of the Chinese language back wherever he was from, right? But he couldn't order his coffee in Chinese. So I was just, wow, okay. Now, it's just one example of many that I've had over the years. I have met not professors, but PhDs. I've met very intelligent people. These are people that make very big salaries in companies as engineers, or they work in universities, who are learning English, or vice versa. They're learning Chinese, or they're learning some other language, and they just can't get their head around it. And I just always wonder, I'm not even really all that smart. Like I find that if I'm going to learn and try to achieve something in my life, I have to do a lot of reps. I really have to put in a lot of effort to learn. I can't just pick up a book and read about quantum mechanics. I've tried to read that book on quantum mechanics by Sussman, and I don't understand it. Mm-hmm. And I can read it 3 times and still not understand it.
So you're a regular guy.
I don't know how people can understand this stuff.
Yeah.
And I can read stuff on all different... I like to read things, and I'll read as much as I can, even though I don't understand it. And I just hope that someday I might understand it. So I like to read about mathematics, I like to read about physics, I like to read about all kinds of things. But I don't understand a lot of what I read. But I like to have the exposure, and I think that through reps, the repetition and exposure to those things, I might someday... it might click for me. So I'm kind of like the bull, the ox, who's very obstinate and stubborn, and I just keep going at it one step at a time. I'm not a Taurus, but I'm kind of like a Taurus in that way. Anyway, I have found that all of these very smart people, and I even heard Bill Gates say it once, one of the regrets they have is never learned a foreign language. And I think that it's not, foreign language is not about intelligence. It's not about smarts. It's not how much you think about it. Because if you think about it, even the littlest kids in all corners of the world speak a language. So there's nothing to think about. And they speak it with correct grammar. I mean, most of the time, if the child is already 5 or 6 years old, everybody speaks their language with correct grammar.
Mm-hmm. How do you explain like expats in different countries who just kind of refuse to learn the local language? Do you think it's lazy, or do you think it's something else, like a deep fear of saying the wrong thing and sounding stupid?
Well, number one, do they actually have a desire to learn it?
Maybe not, right?
You know,
yeah.
If they're just there to do their job, and they get paid for doing a specific job, and that's all they're there to do, and they live in a bubble where they have a community where they don't need to interact with the local population, maybe that's what they want.
Right.
Because you said the word expat, so I assume that they're, like, I don't consider myself an expat living in a foreign, I'm an immigrant. Right. I'm a naturalized immigrant, actually. Yeah. So I do not talk to expats, and I don't talk to foreigners all that often. Mm-hmm. I'm fully integrated in the local community, in the local culture, and I can actually participate in all kinds of government, activities at the local level. So the thing is that I have immersed myself into that environment, and I actually choose to refuse. Like people will speak English to me just because of the way I look all the time,
Yeah.
and I let them speak English to me because I don't have to impose anything on them. I don't require them to treat me in any special way. But I may choose to speak in the local language to them, and they really don't have any say in it either because I'm using the national language. I'm using the language that everybody uses here. And if they continue speaking to me in English, I don't care. They just continue speaking to me in English. If we can communicate and I understand, we might be speaking two different languages to each other. In fact, I speak like that to people in my company all the time. They'll speak to me in Chinese, I'll speak to them in English. And sometimes we'll reverse.
Yeah.
It's just like, as long as we can get our message across, right? So I think it's kind of a fun thing. I've had conversations with people, I don't remember what language I had it in. But I got the information and I said certain things, I don't remember the mode of communication that it was said in. So it's just, you get to the point where it's so superfluous that it's just communication. You know, I was asked the conversation at the Polyglot Conference whether I have a different personality in a different language. I don't in the languages that I'm fluent in. I'm just me.
Right.
Because I don't remember what mode of communication I used for certain conversations. But in the languages that I don't have very good ability in, I struggle to communicate. It's hard, and I'm just not me. It's like I have to simplify everything that I'm saying in order to communicate. So I understand. It's how people can feel like they have a different personality, because you're changing yourself. You can't be fully expressive as who you are in that language unless you're fully fluent and bilingual.
Well, for me to have language, it's like knowledge is power. I think language is power too. Do you think that language learning is something that gives people a huge boost of confidence that they didn't have before?
Yeah. Oh man.
Have you ever seen?
It's like getting ripped at the gym.
Right.
You'll walk out of the gym and you're like, I can lift this car. But language learning is kind of like that. Like you feel like, it's great to have a cell phone that can translate everything for you, but it's great to lose your connection, put it away, and just be able to communicate with people at the same speed that they communicate.
Yeah.
It's a really great feeling,
Right.
especially in a place where you understand what they're saying in a different culture, in a different way than what you were brought up to believe. Mm-hmm. And you're listening to things in a belief system that may be different than what you grew up believing. And you just realize there's different ways to look at the world, there's different ways to understand the world, and there's different truths and realities. There's no one definite 没有绝对. What I want to say in English, there's no absolute
Right.
truth. There's many ways to look at things in the world. So
And language.
and sometimes I think in Chinese and I have to translate back into English. So that's just
I think language provides perspective that we didn't have before.
yeah.
Because you see things the way, for example, a Korean speaker would say it, gives you a new way of looking at things just by learning a language. So.
Yeah.
Tim Ferriss, one of my heroes.
Tim Ferriss, yeah.
Yeah, he recently posted on his Instagram. We know he talks about languages all the time. I think he's a polyglot.
Oh yeah. I think he's learned Chinese and Japanese. Yeah.
Yeah, Spanish. So he said, I'm loving learning Korean basics. Past experience with Chinese and Japanese helps a ton. Anyone out there know of resources for people who already speak Japanese to help them learn Korean faster? For example, and along similar lines, the U.S. State Department long ago published a booklet to help Americans who speak Spanish learn Portuguese quickly. Anything like this exists for Japanese to Korean?
Oh, that booklet, I know it. I've read it. Wait, it's for Spanish speakers to learn Portuguese. Yeah. That was done by DLI, Defense Language Institute. Yeah, so, or maybe it was FSI, one of those two, Foreign Service Institute. We often get them mixed up, who does what, but they pretty much do the same kind of stuff. Okay, so any interesting comments that people are leaving on there?
Let's see.
Like not actually promote, like what are the average citizen comments saying? Oh, can you use Japanese to learn Korean? Okay.
Japanese and Korean are nothing alike, though. Korean language uses hanja, but you can also learn Korean without it.
Well, that's a very silly response because he's learning Korean from English right now. And Korean is written in hanja and English is written in Latin letters. That would be ridiculous to learn Korean from English.
Right.
Let alone think that you could learn Korean from Japanese. And they're not written in hanja.
Right.
Any other interesting comments?
They're all like,
That's a very silly response. Okay.
you might already be doing this, but it could expedite things to learn Korean basics from Japanese textbooks, since much of the grammar is the same. Cuts out the English middleman.
Yeah, okay. So, I think that Tim Ferriss thinks about language and structure in the same way that I do. And that most people are thrown off by writing systems, like that first comment that you said. Writing systems don't define languages, but languages kind of do define writing systems. So there's a reason why Slovak has more letters in its alphabet than any other European language. It just happens to have encode all of the palatalization of the sounds for that language. Whereas Russian uses an extra letter one extra letter to represent all the palatized sounds in the language. So Russian uses much fewer letters because they have one letter for palatalization and Slovak doesn't. So it's kind of interesting when you look at alphabets and how languages influence those alphabets. So you could write Korean in any alphabet you want in the whole world. In romanization, you could write it in Japanese letters, you could write it in Chinese letters. It has been written like that. You could write it in Cyrillic, you could write it in Thai, whatever you want. It would still work. What I'm saying is that writing has nothing to do with actually mastering the language. Writing only allows you to decode what somebody else has said in written format. But writing does not define how you actually speak the language. Okay, so if Korean writing, if it's spelled out, the word for independent, T-O-K, R-I-P, Tokrip, which we call duli in Chinese, or tokrip in Taiwanese. So in Korean, you have to combine the sounds together into a smoother transitional sound. So it's tongnip, tongnip. You change that K and that L into a smooth sound. All of that stuff that goes into the pronunciation of the word, the proper way of pronunciation, is something you're only going to pick up from conversational Korean. It's not 합니다, it's 합니다, and it flows. So the writing system encodes a different kind of language, not exactly all the sounds exactly. But what Tim Ferriss is doing is he's saying, hey, the word order of Korean is kind of similar to Japanese. I'm wondering if I compare Japanese and Korean, would it help me understand the language faster? So yeah, he's using the stepping stone, or like you said, compound interest in learning the other language. He already knows Chinese, so he'll pick up words like tongnip or duli or independent very quickly. Tokuritsu in Japanese. Is it tokuritsu? I don't remember the word in Japanese exactly, but if you take those words and you kind of triangulate and you compare, you can do all of that on Glossica. And in fact, we provide the transcriptions in Chinese characters, in Hanja, and in Hangul, and in the you can use all the different transcriptions and pronunciations. IPA transcription on Glossica. You can compare Japanese and Korean, the same sentences on Glossica. So I think our tool is actually something that he's probably looking for.
Right.
And if he wants, we can give him an account and test it out.
Heard that, Tim?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have your people contact our people.
Yeah, your people and our people.
So what you're saying is you can learn a new language on Glossica from multiple different languages.
Yeah, I mean, you can
from English.
Some people call it laddering. Like they've already learned French, now they're going to use French to learn German or learn Arabic, whatever. Yeah, I mean, I call it triangulation because I like to think of like, I'm going to use two other languages to tackle a new language.
Right.
One might be from the same language family, one might be from having a similar grammatical structure. Like I could use a Dravidian or Turkish. I could use Turkish to learn Korean, even though they're not related. Their word order is the same. And I could use Japanese to learn Korean, and I could triangulate with them, plus my knowledge of Chinese. I could learn Korean pretty well using that triangulation method. even though Korean's different than all three. It's, you know, I could use those hacks to wrap my head around how the language expresses itself, you know.
Yeah, so I think the hardest part is to learn that first language when you have no other language.
Yeah.
And then when you get through that
That's the hardest language to learn in the whole world.
the first one. Yeah.
Your first foreign language is the hardest language to learn in the whole world.
Right.
But if you were to compare all languages in the world to see which one is hardest, they all equal hard,
Yeah.
except for the ones that's probably very similar to your own native language. But any language outside the family they're all equally hard.
Yeah, I learned English and Spanish at the same exact time. And I think when I learned Chinese, I learned it faster than most people. I never really knew why, but people kept saying, "Oh, you sound like a native speaker."
I was impressed by your Chinese because, I mean, you don't really come across to me as somebody who's like necessarily into languages. I don't know, but you're more like business oriented. But I was kind of, because I've met a lot of businessmen in foreign countries that never take the effort to learn a foreign language. So I was always impressed by what you.
That means a lot coming from you, Michael. Oh my.
No, I mean, you're probably in the 1% in terms of like, you can actually, you've started a company in a foreign country using a language completely different than your own, and you're able to use that language in doing business. I mean, you're in the 1% of the 1%.
Seems like I could have made a lot more money using English in the States.
Of course, I mean, we could have all done that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I look back and I don't have any regrets. I've done the same thing that you have, and I don't have any regrets because I think life is a lot more colorful this way. It's a lot more fun. And why not have fun in the process instead of just saying, oh, I got rich overnight, and now what?
Right.
Like, enjoy the journey, you know? It's not like, I always tell people, if you want to get rich overnight, I mean, you can make a new toilet seat. I mean, who wants to make toilets?
Right.
I mean, you could do that and go in an industry nobody cares about, and you know, you could sell them worldwide and blah, 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 blah. You know, it's like, I choose to do something that's really interesting and fascinating, but also has a lot of challenges that I want to, you know, overcome, and I want to focus on doing something that's really central to human thought and psychology, and you know, look at me all getting all excited here.
All right. Cool. Well, that's great
Yeah.
to understand the whole, the bigger picture behind Glossica and your motivations. And,
Oh yeah.
we look forward to what the future brings with Glossica. And then, you know, of course, you're always present at a lot of language polyglot events. So
Yeah.
I think you're well known in the polyglot community.
We got a few more events coming up. I was in Fukuoka, Japan, Cholula, Mexico, and then in Budapest, Hungary. As of the time at which we are filming this, we have an upcoming event in just a few days in Penang, in Malaysia, northern Malaysia. And then we have next year's events in Prague, in Czechia. So we'll...
All right. So some of the insiders can see Michael live at those places.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks
Definitely.
a lot.